Jean-Luc Godard does this as well, French director. There was a scene in one film where the actors were walking through a field, and it was a very long and boring scene, and then the characters turn around and say, what a long and boring film we're in, you know? And suddenly you're briefly become aware that it's a film, and it breaks the suspension of disbelief. But there's a certain sense in which we are a fiction ourselves. And there are moments when we realise that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are a form of fiction, that our beliefs don't tell us who we are. Our beliefs are designed to prevent us from knowing who we are. Now, that can sound counterintuitive. Surely, I am my beliefs. But what I would argue is that there's a parable I'm fond of telling, but just very simple. A guy comes back to a castle, a king, and he sees a beggar, and he says, get rid of the beggar, execute him, get rid of him, just put him out of the city. I don't care what you do. You know that I'm such a kind and compassionate man that I cannot bear to look upon such suffering, right? Now, interestingly, in the UK, the adverts that get the most complaints on TV, I've heard this anyway, are animal rights adverts. People hate that. People hate to see animals suffering because we love animals. Don't show us how much suffering is going on. You know that I'm such a kind and compassionate person, I cannot bear to look upon such suffering. Or, we know like where our clothes are made or where our cocoa beans are picked, and we don't want to be confronted because our beliefs are not what tells us who we are. Our beliefs are what prevent us from experiencing the materiality of who we are. And so what I'm arguing for is, and you see this in AA again, to come back to AA, what's the first thing you have to do? My name's Pete and I'm an alcoholic. You have to admit the reality of your material reality. Because what does an alcoholic do before that? Nah, I'm not an alcoholic, I could give up any time I want, it's not a problem, it's not this, it's not that. The first thing you have to do as an alcoholic is admit to yourself your own being. And can I say one other thing about this? Very simple. This probably takes me on a tangent, but this is my new work. I've just written a book called The Divine Magician. We think that what we want is what we fantasize about. That's the other thing I want to disrupt. That actually the last thing we want is what we fantasize about and what we desire. And what I want is to disrupt that, is to show us that what we think we want and what we think we believe and who we think we are is a kind of veil. And it's productive and it's useful at times, but it can also be problematic. Yeah. There's kind of two ways that you can create community. And one is where you have this thing that we have the answer. We have the thing that will make us happy. We have it. We have this object, this idol, I argue in the books. But then what happens is we need someone who is other. We have the answer, they don't. We're always excluding someone. We're always scapegoating someone who is outside of our community. And what we think is that if we got rid of them, things would be better. So for the fascist, the figure of the Jew is the person that you have to get rid of. If only we could get rid of them, then we could have a whole community, then everything would be fine, everything would be good. But no. The point is, the figure of the Jew is the very person who prevents them from experiencing the trauma and the brokenness and the conflict within the community. If they got rid of their opposition, their obstacle, they would discover that actually there are intrinsic antagonisms and problems within the community itself. So they actually require the scapegoat in order to survive as a community. And you see this obviously in churches in various forms, where the way to maintain a sense of identity is by having another that's out. In Russia, you had this with the kulaks. In Soviet Russia, the kulaks were the peasants who owned the means of production, and they were seen as the problem. But as the kulaks were persecuted and murdered, then you could see the internal conflicts within the Soviet state. And so they had to widen out the interpretation of who a kulak was, until a kulak was someone who thought like a kulak. And then it wasn't even someone who thought like a kulak, it was someone who would think like a kulak if they had the money to think like a kulak. In other words, it was just anybody. Because you needed some external opposition to prevent yourself from encountering your own brokenness, your own unknowing, your own problems and difficulties. You see it beautifully expressed in the film Brief Encounter from the 1950s, where two people have a brief affair, but it's never consummated. They never have sex. There's a point, however, when they almost do. You know, they're thinking about, you know, their husband and their wife, and they're thinking, we can't really do this, we can't have an affair, you know, things would be awful if we did. But eventually they both break through all of those oppositions, and they end up in the apartments of the guy's friend. And just as they're about to embrace, true to Hollywood, this is a Hollywood trope, just as they're about to embrace, the door opens, their friend has unexpectedly returned home, and they have to separate, and they kind of never see each other again. And what this is that this is, in a sense, a cinematic reflection of a subjective prohibition. In other words, there's always something that prevents them from being one. There's always something that prevents them from coming together and having that beautiful, idyllic relationship. Why? Because it's impossible. They can't have the beautiful, idyllic relationship. Because if they ever did have sex, if they ever did leave their partners and join together and go off, they discover that they're just as broken as they were before. They discover that things were just as bad as before, and they'd have to face themselves. And so you create an obstacle in order to prevent yourself from experiencing the true obstacle, which is this would not help. It's like me saying to a friend, hold me back while I defend my girlfriend's honour with that jerk at the bar, right? And somebody holds me back. So I go to fight the person and then I'm held back, you know? Because I do that. Why? To protect myself and everybody else from the true obstacle, which is I get my head kicked in, right? So to protect myself from the real obstacle is I couldn't actually defend the person. I have to create an obstacle to prevent myself experiencing the horror of it. My point here is this, is there's two ways of developing community. One is the scapegoat mechanism. The problem is always on the outside. The problem is always the other. Or we can create communities like AA. AA is a group of people who go, no, we're the broken ones. We're the dejected. We're the trash of the world. We're the ones who have the problem. And they find unity and they find community in the embrace of that brokenness. How many wars have been fought over AA? How many armies have been created by those communities? None that I know of. It's perhaps the most successful Christian denomination in the 20th century. And yeah, you know, well, where are they? You don't know where they are, and yet I could throw a stone and probably hit one, you know? Christianity has nothing to do with some set of beliefs that you can tick and somehow get in. Kierkegaard says, like, you know, heaven's some sort of exam. It's a mode of life in which we learn to embrace our brokenness, our unknowing, our doubts. We learn to embrace complexity. We're honest with our shadow sides. We have what Barry was talking about with St. Paul, a revelation of our darkness. It wasn't a revelation of light. Paul encounters how he was killing other people, how he was scapegoating others, and he is transformed. That we embrace that brokenness. That the good news of Christianity is not you can be happy, whole and complete and know all the answers. No, the good news of Christianity is simple. Life is shit and you don't know the answers. You're like, what? How can that be good news? It's wonderful news. Because you know what? We all know it already, but we repress it. Oh, no, I could be happy if only I had that money, if only I had that person, if only I had this, that or the other thing. And we know that's rubbish. The good news is when we let that go, the temple curtain is rended in two. We discover the thing we're pursuing is nothing. We learn to be, and we find that the depth of faith is found not in something over the hill, over there, just beyond our reach, but is found in the depth of life itself, in desiring the people around us, desiring a better world, desiring to transform this existence, not to live after death, but to learn the possibility of living before death. Simple. It's not rocket science, it's much harder.